Elvis Presley's final concert, The Night Rock and Roll, said goodbye. June 26, 1977, Market Square Arena, Indianapolis. Nobody in that crowd of 18,000 knew they were about to witness history. The king of rock and roll was about to take the stage for the very last time. The energy was electric as fans lined up outside the arena, some having waited overnight in the summer heat just to buy tickets. $15 got you a seat, even if it was behind the stage. By today's standards, that's nearly $60. But for a chance to see Elvis Presley live, every penny felt worth it. What those fans didn't know was that the man they'd come to see was fighting battles they couldn't imagine. At 42 years old, Elvis was carrying far more than just extra weight. He was carrying the burden of being a legend who couldn't afford to disappoint anyone. The concert was scheduled to start at 8:30, but Elvis wouldn't hit the stage until nearly 10 p.m. Opening acts filled the time, brass bands and soul singers warming up the crowd. Comedian Jackie Kahane worked to keep the energy high, telling the audience what they desperately wanted to hear. Elvis looks great, and Elvis sounds great. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. Elvis's personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, had tried to convince him to cancel. The singer had been hospitalized 4 times in the past 5 years. His body was breaking down from hypertension, an enlarged colon, liver damage, and glaucoma. Each condition made worse by the prescription medications he'd become dependent on just to get through each day. "Elvis, you need rest," Dr. Nick had pleaded before the show. "Your body can't take much more of this." But Elvis refused. "The people came to see me, Doc. I can't let them down. I've never let them down." Those words carried the weight of a man who'd pulled his entire family out of poverty and felt responsible for everyone who depended on him. Canceling wasn't an option. Not for the king. When Elvis finally walked onto that stage, the crowd erupted. But something was different. Those close enough to the stage could see it in his movements. The famous hip swivels were slower. His white jumpsuit, emblazoned with an Aztec-style sun design, hung looser than it should have. He looked exhausted before he'd even sung a note. He opened with C.C. Rider, one of his classics. The voice was still there, still powerful, but it carried a heaviness that hadn't been present in earlier years. Throughout the 80-minute performance, he'd go through 21 songs, each one a piece of his legendary catalog. The Indianapolis press couldn't agree on what they'd witnessed. Rita Rose from the Indianapolis Star tried to be kind. At 42, Elvis is still carrying around some excess baggage on his midsection, but it didn't stop him from giving a performance in true Presley style. She praised his renditions of It's Now or Never and This Time You Gave Me a Mountain, noting how the crowd went wild when he tossed his scarves into the audience. But Zach Duncan from the Indianapolis News saw it differently. "Elvis Presley led another crowd of screamers in Banana Land last night," he wrote harshly. "The question is why? He obviously doesn't need the money." Duncan complained about the long wait, the opening acts, and what he called inadequate sound and lighting. "It's time ardent Presley fans quit protecting their idol and start demanding more. They know the king can do better." The tragic irony? Elvis would never get that chance. Somewhere in the middle of that performance, Elvis sat at the piano. This was always his most vulnerable moment on stage, when the spectacle stripped away and only the raw emotion remained. The songs he chose seemed almost prophetic. My Way. It's Now or Never. Songs about living life on your own terms, about seizing the moment before it slips away. Then came Unchained Melody. His voice, raw and emotional, poured everything he had left into those lyrics. People in the audience felt something they couldn't quite name, a finality, a goodbye wrapped in melody. As the concert moved toward its close, Elvis performed Can't Help Falling in Love, the ballad that had become his signature closing number. When the final notes faded, he stood at the front of the stage and looked out at the crowd. Not his usual dramatic exit, but something more measured, more deliberate. "We'll meet you again, God bless. Adios." Those were his final words to an audience, his final words to the world as a performer. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is what was happening behind the scenes. Just weeks before that Indianapolis concert, CBS had taped 2 shows in Omaha and Rapid City for a television special called Elvis in Concert. The footage was devastating. In the Omaha show on June 19th, his voice was described as almost unrecognizable, a small, childlike instrument. He looked pale, swollen, struggling. 2 days later in Rapid City on June 21st, he seemed slightly better. Reports said he looked healthier, seemed to have lost a little weight. But by the end of that performance, his face was described as framed in a helmet of blue-black hair from which sweat sheets down over pale, swollen cheeks. This was the 1977 tour, a grueling schedule that would ultimately consist of 55 concerts. Elvis was running on fumes, prescription medications, and sheer force of will. Friends said he'd been talking about life differently in those final months, making comments about legacy, about being remembered for the music rather than the struggles. The pressure was immense. In just the first 8 months of 1977, his doctor had prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics, all in Elvis's name. The medications that were supposed to help him perform were slowly destroying him. After Indianapolis, Elvis returned to Graceland. He had concerts scheduled to resume in August. He talked about it being the best tour ever, trying to convince himself and everyone around him that he could turn things back around. On August 1st, 1977, a book called Elvis: What Happened was published. Written by 3 of his former bodyguards, it detailed his years of prescription drug use. Elvis was devastated. He tried to stop its publication by offering money to the publishers. It didn't work. His last public appearance came in the early morning hours of August 8th, when he rented out the entire Libertyland amusement park in Memphis for himself and his entourage, a private moment away from the world that was watching him struggle. But it was too late. The king was gone. Just 51 days after his final performance in Indianapolis, he was 42 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia related to hypertensive heart disease, but the toxicology report told a more complicated story, revealing at least 10 different pharmaceutical drugs in his system. The autopsy was sealed by his father, Vernon, not to be opened until 2027, 50 years after his death. Later investigations would reveal the full extent of his suffering. His colon, which should have been 4 to 5 feet long, measured 8 to 9 feet. Instead of the normal 2 to 3 inches in diameter, it was 5 to 6 inches wide. He'd been born with a genetic condition that caused severe constipation, something he considered embarrassing and a sign of weakness. He had an enlarged heart, liver damage, glaucoma, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes. Some researchers now believe he suffered from an autoimmune disorder triggered by a serious head injury in 1967. Dr. Nick himself said Elvis was never the same after he hit his head in 1967. But beyond all the medical reports and autopsy findings, there's a simpler truth. Elvis Presley was a man who gave everything he had to his music and his fans, right up until his body simply couldn't give anymore.